a lot of the anxiety and doubt around decisions happens because one of three problems. This is the first, where we don't see that a decision is simply destiny unfolding, that we can't make a wrong decision according to or relative to destiny. We can only have destiny unfolding. We can make a wrong decision relative to an outcome. So in hindsight, we can say that decision didn't deliver a very good outcome. And so relative to a good outcome, we can say that wasn't a great decision. However, our attitude needs to hold that in a greater picture that says, but it was the only decision that could have been made. And if there is an appreciation that decisions are part of the unfolding of the of life and destiny, that we're forced to make whatever decision we make based on the circumstance and our genes and up-to-date conditioning, or the other way we can look at it, it's always God's will unfolding. And God's will unfolds through the exercise of what seems like my free will. But when we look at it, we find it's actually a functioning of my genes and up-to-date conditioning that I had no control over. The other part of decision-making that tends to make us feel anxious and uncomfortable is when we mistake outcomes as something more than just pleasure or pain. When we believe that our completeness, our happiness is to be found in outcomes, a decision holds much more importance than when we understand that our decision is simply going to result in an outcome, and that outcome is either pleasure or pain. And if we've come to understand that my happiness is not dependent on pleasure or pain, it's not dependent on whether an outcome is in line with my preferences or not. The outcome being in line with my preferences or not means pleasure versus pain. If, however, we are attached to pleasure and pain, which really means we're convinced that my completeness, my happiness, my survival is dependent on outcomes, then we're bound to be very fearful when making decisions. Because the consequence is psychologically held as being much more than it actually is. So with this attitude, the attitude that when I make a decision, that is destiny unfolding, and regardless of what the decision is, the outcome is not in my control, and the outcome is either going to be pleasure or pain, and my completeness, my sense of existence, my beingness is not dependent on the outcome. I am, even if I make a bad investment choice, I might experience financial pain, and yet if I ground into my being, I find I am as fully in the absence of finances as I was in the presence of finances. And another factor with decision making is to learn that you can't make a decision until the time is right. So if it's not destined for you to make a decision today, thinking that you have to make a decision today adds a load of suffering over a day when it's not destined for you to make a decision. So my movement was towards making decisions based on what I feel like, which really means let me feel what is there in the moment. And so if the decision isn't clear and I find I just don't have enough information or enough direction as to pick one of the various options, then my attitude is my decision is to make no decision, because I can't make a decision if there isn't an impulse to make a decision. And if days go past and a consequence is looming, then maybe your attitude can be, well, I can only make a decision when I make a decision. And if a consequence is delivered because I haven't made a decision, then that consequence is just pleasure or pain. And what I found is that there can be a period of 2 or 3 weeks where I feel it's essential that I make a decision, and I can't make a decision. And so for a period of 2 weeks, I might be thinking the old way of thinking. I should be making a decision. I can't make a decision. This is a real problem. I need to figure out what decision to make. So you can have all of that suffering, or you can just say, oh, I don't feel it, so it's not my decision is to make no decision. And days might go past where you make that decision and then you relax. No, can't make a decision. And then one day you wake up and you find the circumstance has changed, or your feeling has radically changed, and the decision is made really simply. But it only gets made simply on the day when it's destined for everything to come together in order for there to be an obvious decision. So the decision is made not by you, but the decision arises, and then you feel it and you go, oh, I'm going to say yes to that offer, or I'm going to say no to that offer. And the thing is to trust, based on your experience, that I can let a decision be a decision of no decision, and then one day, when it's destined, when the time is right, the decision is easy. So a combination of all these things means that decisions and the process of decision making becomes related to with a very different attitude. And the last thing I would say about decisions is Ramesh used to say that because everything is predetermined, including how we make the decision and what the outcome is of that decision, said some people will be designed by life to make calculated decisions. So Ramesh would say he made calculated decisions. I make very calculated decisions. Now, someone else may not be designed to make calculated decisions. So Ramesh said, if you're not designed to make calculated decisions, toss a coin. And he said, whether you make a decision based on it being calculated or whether you toss a coin, all of that is destiny unfolding. Both the decision itself, and the outcome of the decision is destined. So if your attitude is, I'm not designed to make a calculated decision, I need to make a decision right now, so toss a coin. If it's heads, say yes. If it's tails, say no. And that is as valid a way relative to the unfolding of life, of making a decision, as making a calculated decision. It doesn't mean that you are going to get the same results, but the result is always out of your control. If you're not designed to make calculated decisions, well, tossing a coin is one way of making a decision.
Yeah, that I think answers all of my follow-up questions too. What struck me really well was I've been listening to Ramesh Balsekar's videos on YouTube a lot, and his story about the Chinese farmer seemed very thoughtful, and something that like struck me at heart. It's basically like what you're saying. I don't know if my understanding is correct, but essentially decisions are made. It really depends on your attitude, how you see things, whether it's it could be pain or it could be pleasure. You just say maybe and then move on to the next one and keep going with the flow of life, I guess.
Yes, that's a particular attitude, especially to outcomes that have not turned out in line with your preference, where we have to realize that something that turns out not so good may be actually the beginning of something quite good. And when we see that life is continually morphing and that we don't really know what this is going to turn into, then we stop having a definite story that says, this is the end of my life. This decision was terrible and it's the end of my life. Because the truth is that, a, what seems like an unfortunate decision or an unfortunate outcome, losing a job, someone might lose a job and think that that's the worst thing that could have happened. And in hindsight, or a relationship, and in hindsight, often we look back and we think, actually, that was a godsend. And so when we really click on the fact that I don't know how it's going to turn out, even though in this moment it doesn't seem like it's a great result, then when we really appreciate I do not know, and often it turns out much better than it feels in the moment, then we stop having a story about it. And we say, well, let's see.